And so for this recording, starting here at the clavicle, we have three ends, a flat end called the acromial end. Remember, use this word to remind you of shoulder. Sternal end connects to the sternal bone that is medial to the body. And so if you're asked, what does it form a joint with? You are answering the sternum. On this side, you are answering the scapula. Do not forget that if you look at the bottom of this bone, it is called the conoid tubercle. Conoid tubercle. And it's just going to be this little bump that you can see there.
A question for the practicum, do we need to say if it's a right or left?
You will need to say if it's a right or left, but only if they ask you for the bone. Meaning that if they place a scapula, because keep in mind you have two scapulas, and when they place that bone down, they are going to ask you specifically, is this a left or a right? You don't have to write left conoid tubercle, left acromial end. You just have to say left clavicle or right clavicle, or just left or right if it asks you. So it will ask it directly. That's the only time you need to be writing left or right, right? So the question will read, is this a left or a right? And then you write left or right. Otherwise, you don't need to worry about left or right, only if it asks you. I hope that makes sense. And so this first bone is the best example to learn our left and right, or to keep that in focus. So look for your scapula, take it out of your box. Take it out of your box. It should be triangular in shape. And that's it right there. If you want, you can raise it up with both hands, please. Do not drop it. No, not that one. Yes, 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 yes. Yes, back there. Yes, yes, and yes, and back there, you got it right there. That's your scapula. And so if you look at that scapula, it's actually pretty hard to tell if it's left or right, but you have some easy clues. Do you have two on your table? Yes, let me borrow one. And so how you're going to tell as students in anatomy is that when you look at this bone, right, you'll note that there's one side that is flat. It's flat like this. And then it also there's one that's not so flat because it has this huge structure on it. And so again, on this side, you'll see flatness. And on this side, you'll see this structure. Now, this is going to be an important bone marking for you. This is called the spine. Only one side has it, right? The other side is flat. And so this is your spine. And as you examine this bone now, you only have a few things to understand. The spine of a book probably should be facing, or the spine of anything should be on what side? The back. So you make sure that this is facing towards the back. But that still gives you two options, one on this side or one on this side. But all we have to keep track of is what's going to be hanging from here? The arm. And so this should be what direction? Medial or lateral? Lateral. Because now if you place it like this, right, this is the spine's back here. I make the spine face back, and if it's like this, it doesn't make sense. I can't sock it here. It just doesn't make sense. But if you place the spine backwards again, then you'll see that it has that little triangular, little hooky look to hold on to your next bone that we're going to learn about in a second. But it holds the limb. And so two features you want to keep track of on this bone when you start. You want to keep track of the spine, and you want to keep track of the glenoid cavity. The glenoid cavity. And that's what that structure is. And so back to our notes here. And let me give you back this bone. And so look at your bone and decide if it's a left or a right. And use your own body. And just keep in mind that during the exam you won't be able to elevate the bones. They'll be covered by this plastic. And so it's okay to look around and move around on the bone. And that's really what you want to do, is you want to orientate your body to the bone when it's laying out flat for you. And so two features you want to learn first. The rest of it is easy peasy on this bone. First, you see this structure, that little socket is called the glenoid cavity. That's going to be a new word for all of us. Glenoid cavity. Glenoid cavity. And if we keep going, I'll use my little pen marking here. Then we have our spine. These two features are the first ones you should use to learn if a bone is left or right. And let's write that in my notes now since I am recording this. right, use spine plus glenoid cavity. You can call it glenoid cavity or glenoid fossa. Both are acceptable. To determine left or right. And the rest of this bone is easy peasy. This border is just called the border, the edge of it. And so if it's on the top of the bone, it's called a superior border. And this glenoid cavity, it should be what direction again? Lateral. So the border underneath it or on the same side is going to be called simply lateral border. Lateral border. You can even see it's called axillary border sometimes because it's on the armpit side. Armpit side. And this vertebral border, if you're not really good with your medial, then vertebral means that it's facing the vertebra. And so again, if you're looking at it here, this would be the vertebral border because it's closest to the vertebra. And then this would be your acromial border because it's closest to the armpit. And so you have three views when you look at it, right? You have an anterior view. This is what it looks like if you're front facing a skeleton. That's why it doesn't have a spine in that segment. And so superior, lateral, and medial border. This side to us is just called body. And if we turn it and face directly at our glenoid cavity or glenoid fossa, you'll see that there are two segments, two hooks. I always just think of them as like hooks in a way. And this hook is going to be simply called acromion because remember, acromial meant the shoulder, and even for simplicity, acromial end, you can see that's the end of the clavicle, and what's the structure here going to be called? Acromion. So it's really easy to sort of learn these first bones because they're sort of named after that very fact there. And so that acromial end of the clavicle will find this part, which is called the acromion. And this is going to be connected to the spine, So if you follow your spine, and let's use this side, this picture here, that if you follow your spine, follow, you end up with at the acromion side. All right, so that's the best way to find it. To find a way to remember, spine is linked to acromion. SA maybe, some sort of acronym that you can come up with. And then the one that's not connected to the spine, that's going to be on the anterior side, on top of the body, is going to be the coracoid process. Coracoid, and I want you to, for now, underline this C. You'll know why in a bit. Coracoid. There's a word that sounds very close to it. And that sums up your scapula. And those are all the terms you need to know for scapula, so it's not very bad. If we go now, dig into your boxes for your humerus. And it should look like this. It should have a rounded top, and it should have a flat, nubby end at the bottom. And let's see. Yes, that's it right there. That's it right there. Yes. No. It's too small. No, that's a femur. That one you have is correct. Yes. No, that's a tibia. And it looks more rounded. Yes. No to that one. Just that one. And yes. And so let me borrow these. Yes, and so some of these may not be real, some of them are. And so back to our little slide deck. Now, as always, the most important thing to determine is this a left or a right? And so, using my body here, if you look at the bones here, you'll see there's this nubby segment here. This is called the head. It's kind of simple, right? This is the body of something. This is my head. This is the head of the bone. And so this rounder part only is the head, right? And so the important part for that is that you kind of have the idea that that's the segment that's going to socket into that glenoid cavity of the scapula, sockets. But you can see you have a problem as anatomy students is that you don't know if it's left or right because you can socket this way or you can socket this way. So what do you do as students is first You find the head, and then you know which side is going to be medial. And then afterwards, all you have to do is look at the bottom. We don't care about what the names of these are yet. But you look for this huge thumbprint-looking segment at the very back end here. And that's the one in the back. And then when you look in the front, you'll see that it has two little ones on top of this little hourglass figure in a way. It looks like an hourglass a little bit. It looks like a pawn, like from a chessboard in a way. And so you have two little finger divots in there on the front part of it, and on the back posterior side you have your one thumbprint there. We don't care about the names yet. But that thumbprint should always be facing backwards. It should always be facing backwards. So this bone becomes really easy because this one's really easy to tell, but this one will always be facing towards the back, and so this bone is a right humerus, So take a moment, everybody look at the bone, find that thumbprint, and let's make a note of it on our packets. Yes, and here I'm going to write use head. And let's give a name to that. And that big thumbprint should be facing what direction? And now think about your anatomical regions. What is the back of the elbow called? Olecranon. It's named after that very thing. If we just skip ahead, it's called the olecranon fossa. So you already sort of know this term, right? Olecranon, you just have to adjust because now this is a bone marking. Olecranon was talking about the entire back part of the elbow, but olecranon fossa is the name of this particular little divot, that little thumbprint that I keep calling it. So you're going to use your head and the olecranon fossa. Sorry, I have it upwards for the camera, and it's going to be really hard for me to write. And that's it. Wait, what? Oh, sorry about that. And also, misspelling my own freaking words here. This is an R. Sorry. I've been told my R's are terrible. There it is. Olecranon fossa for left and right. And that's how you're going to determine what side the humerus goes on. And so, other features now. A word we want to log away is tubercle, and tubercle tends to mean something along the lines of, we're going to think about it as a bump to keep our lives a little bit easier, a bump. And you can see that you have two. You have one large one called the greater, and then you have another one called the lesser. And when you look at it, there should be, on the most lateral part of the bone, should be the greater tubercle. So it should be the opposite side of the head. The opposite side of the head. And so it's going to be just the huge bump that you see there. And then if you look at the center of the bone, you'll see the smaller bump, the smaller bump. And so that's the greater tubercle and the lesser tubercle. Now, if we examine that same head one more time, just like every human head, there's a neck. And so this bone in particular has two necks. One is going to be here. This is going to be the anatomical neck, the one that's directly attached to the head itself. Directly attached to the head itself. The next neck you have is called the surgical neck. And so that's going to be the beginning of the entire shaft. That's what this whole segment is referred to as, the shaft of the bone. And so you can see that this bracket is the shaft. And the reason I say it over and over again is because this S, I want that to remind you that this is the surgical neck and not the anatomical neck. Use the S in the word shaft to help you remember which neck is which, because that's a very common or difficult thing to remember, especially with all these terms swirling in your head. So the anatomical neck is directly attached to the head. The surgical neck will be the one attached directly to the shaft. And so the last little terms to address here is that this great tubercle and this lesser tubercle has this little divot or this little space on the inside. And that little inside space is called the intertubercular sulcus. How easy is that? It's like tubercle. It's the same word as tubercle up here. But it's saying inter. In Latin, this means between, like like to in between in a way, sort of like a, no, it doesn't really help. But like international in a way, like inter means between nations, international. National would be just the one nation. International would be something like a communication between different nations. And so intertubercular is the space in between the tubercles. Intertubercular groove or sulcus. The word sulcus means groove. So you're welcome to use either groove or sulcus for this term. And now in the shaft, there's two things that we can ask you along this. If they put a sticker that's like this long, or they put a stickers that go all the way down here, you're answering shaft. But if they just put a little sticker somewhere along the top portion of that shaft, that is going to be your deltoid tuberosity. The word tuberosity also means a type of bump. And we'll get into what these words actually mean. I'm just trying to keep it easier for simplicity today. But it just means a bump in a way, a groove. There's a lot of words for grooves and bumps. So try to just remember that it's some sort of bump. And it's called the deltoid tuberosity because the muscle we have right here, what is it called probably? Do you guys know? The deltoid. And so this muscle is attached right there with a tendon. And what connective tissue makes up tendons? Dense regular. And so dense regular, it's okay, that's why we do this. And then so this one now, the way muscles move is that this entire muscle is going to be attached to the very top. And so that's how it moves the skeleton, because now this muscle moves upwards towards where it's attached to. And so you can all imagine that the arm goes up as this muscle contracts that way. It brings the bone upwards. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about muscles. And so this is called your deltoid tuberosity because it's the site of attachment for the shoulder muscle, the deltoid. And keep in mind that if we were to make a transverse section here, we would see certain types of tissues. What type of tissue did we see here? Osteocytes and what, a bone tissue. And what type of bone was it? Anybody remember? A compact. And then you can see that the center is very hollow, sort of a preview of what we're going to learn about later in the lecture today. And so, as we go to the distal portion of the bone, meaning the inferior part of the bone, we're looking at the anterior side. Here you can see that there's this bump and that other bump I was talking about. And now we got to add a new fact. And you don't have to jump slides, I'll do it for you here. Is that the next bone that you're going to encounter is called the radius and the ulna. And the radius will always be on the thumb side of anatomical position. Oops. When we're in anatomical position, the radius is always going to be on thumb side. So as you look at this radial fossa, your brain should jump to that this is the more lateral structure, the more lateral groove or opening. And relate that to the greater tubercle, because you know that the greater tubercle is going to be the most lateral structure at the very top. And so you should assume it's going to be underneath that greater tubercle or the opposite of the head. And so you can see it's going to be on that lateral side. The next little opening or the next little groove is called the coronoid fossa. Coronoid. And here you want to underline your N. The reason I had you underline a word up top, the C, was because these two words sound almost exactly the same. The only difference is that the other word has a C in it. So the word coracoid, coronoid, and I see students confuse it all the time, so that's why I'm drawing your attention to it. Try to remember alphabetical order. That coracoid is found on the scapula. Coracoid, found on the scapula. And so the scapula comes first. Think in alphabetical order, C. And the other one had an N. What comes first in the alphabet? C. So C, N. That's the best way I've learned to teach it, just C and N. alphabetical order to help you remember which one's which. If you're like having a trouble connecting those words, coronoid and coracoid. And then the next thing to add here is, what does the word fossa mean? And fossa always means meeting site. Meeting site. So you see radial fossa, you see the coronoid fossa. All of them are going to be meeting sites for something we're going to see in a sec. Now the next keyword is condyle. Condyle. And this word is always going to represent the part of the bone that's going to be connected to the next bone or the next part of the limb, the more distal bones. And so condyle is a meeting site. Again, it's not that much more different from fossa, but that they're not really like openings. Dang it, this is too large. They're not really flat or little grooves or pits, but they're actually more rounded. I'll put rounded meeting sites. Rounded meeting sites. And we all know what the word epi in Latin means, so this just means above the condyle. How easy is that? Condyle. And so this condyle is going to be the meeting site. This entire segment is going to be the meeting site of the bones that follow, the ulna and the radius. But this condyle has components to it, and one of them is called the capitulum. And that's going to be this one little marble-looking portion, the more rounded portion. And it's going to be underneath the radial fossa. And then this next one's called the trochlea, and the trochlea is going to be this whole segment here. It looks sort of like an hourglass in a way. And that trochlea will be underneath the coronoid fossa. And so keep that in mind, that even though fossa is a meeting site, it's more of a pit, of a little dip. You'll notice that it's like a little groove, or it goes into the bone. And when it's a condyle, it's actually coming out. It just looks like this, like nubs in a way. And that's really, last thing to add. And so if this is the condyle made up of the capitulum and the trochlea, then the segment right above it is called the lateral epicondyle. And the segment on the other side, medial epicondyle. Medial epicondyle. And that sums up this bone. This is the same bone, but now we're flipping it around. And what was the name of that little impression in the back? Olecranon fossa. This is going to be a key feature for you. If you can recognize it, you know that it always faces posterior. It should be your biggest clue for this bone. And from the posterior view, you can only see the trochlea. You can't really see the capitulum because it's on the other side, on the forward, the front, or the front of the bone, the anterior side. But you can see very well the epicondyle and the lateral condyle. And again, that's just going to be everything that isn't these condyles. And that's it for this bone. So as we progress, there are these two bones, the radius and the ulna now. And what you're going to look for is this shape. It's a slimmer bone. This is going to make like a U. It looks like a U. That's going to be your ulna. Look for your ulna first. And perfect. And pass me your perfect. And let's get the hummus. All right, so easy concepts first before we get into details. as you're looking at the humerus, right, we just left, this portion, this on the distal side, is our condyle. Here's the capitulum. Again, it's rounded. And then the entire hourglass is the trochlea. And so this is going to be the anterior side and the posterior side. And so these are called fossa. Fossa, 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 meeting site. So what is it meeting? That's what this bone is going to address. If you see this shape, without even getting to what it's called, that's what even the trochlea does, is that it creates a position for a swivel. And so you can see back here that the olecranon fossa allows this top part to actually go into that olecranon fossa. So this is called the olecranon. How easy is that? So this is called olecranon, and this is called olecranon fossa. It's like saying the meeting site for the olecranon. So just by learning this one, you've learned this top part. And even easier, this is called the olecranon, and on the front side we had a radial fossa, and then we have a coronoid fossa. So what do we think this bottom part is going to be called? Coronoid. Nice and easy. And so you can see as it swivels, this little portion right here, the bottom of this little U, this bottom portion, is going to be, when it swirls in, you'll see that it goes into the coronoid fossa. So it goes into that little space. And so this is what allows for the bending of the elbow. And in smart people talk, we say flexion of the elbow. That's why you have this hinge ability, because these bones are capable of fitting nice and snug with each other like this. All right? And so here, this top portion is the olecranon. The bottom portion is called the coronoid. And the word process typically implies sort of, just a process. I always define these things by what they are. Like I already used the word bump. I don't want to use it again. It's more like describing something leaving the origin. Like when I think about like this bone, here's the center of it, right? Is the center. And then so a process means that it grows away from the center, And then so process tends to be sort of something that just protrudes out. Even this one's technically called an olecranon process, but you can just learn it as olecranon. So olecranon, and this one coronoid or coronoid process. I'll let you use just coronoid if you'd like. And here on this segment, the entire thing together is the trochlear notch. And remember that the portion right above was called trochlea. Once more so you can see with a picture. It was called the trochlea. So it makes sense that that notch is going to wrap around the trochlea. So when you look at this top part, the whole thing is called trochlear notch. Just the top part, olecranon. Just the bottom part, coronoid process. You'll also see that there's this indentation on this side of the medial side of this bone, because there's a bone that this bone is partnered with, and it's going to be the radius. And you can see that the radius needs a little space so that it can fit nice and snug with that ulna. And so, let's move on. On this photo, you're looking at it from the anterior side. You're seeing the entire trochlea. The top part is the olecranon. The bottom part is the coronoid process. And there's going to be a radial notch that meets the radius next door. And if we examine, we stay on the ulna, and we progress in a distal direction, you'll see that that tiny pointy end is like a stylus. Think about like a stylus. Like this pen is a stylus in a way. It's like those pens that you use to write on electronic devices, a stylus. And usually a styloid process is going to be a sharper looking object. A sharper looking object. And so you can see it's like a little growth, but this one's sharper. Usually that's why it's called styloid process. And then the last thing to add is that we've all seen that the radius has a head that's more proximal, just like this radius, just like the humerus, right? One more time. This humerus here. This is going to be the head. It's on the proximal part of the bone, the superior part. But when you look at the ulna, it's the opposite. It's the only bone that does this in the limb, and we're pretty much done with the limb actually after this. And then when you see this, the head of ulna is actually at the bottom of it. So you always have to pretend this bone is doing sort of a handstand in a way. He's upside down, upside down. So the head and then our styloid process. But this is still considered the distal part of the ulna, even though it's called the head. That can be a little confusing. When you look at the bone next door, this one's going to be the radius, and its head meets that little radial notch. Again, that radial notch is going to be this little groove that's going to be found right in that segment there. On this bone, it looks like this. This is that same radial notch that we're seeing, this space here. That's your radial notch. You'll notice that the other side doesn't have that at all. It doesn't have the radial notch. And so what side is our radius on? Pardon? Thumb side. And so if we're in anatomical position, what's the more appropriate way to say what side the radius is on? The lateral side. And so when you look at this bone, the radius in your head should be the most lateral bone. And this one should be medial in anatomical position. Or pinky side. Pinky side. So the way you can remember that quickly, because that is sort of a tough thing to remember at first, is think of, when kids smell something bad, they always go, P-U, like that. Like think P-U, pinky, ulna, pinky, ulna, pinky, ulna. So then you always remember that your ulna is on your pinky side. So always remember P-U, and then that helps remember that. And with that, there's not really much more to address other than there is this little bump underneath the head of the radius called the radial tuberosity. It's going to be this groove that elevates out. This groove that elevates out. And that's really it. This is a joint we're going to see in class, and we'll address it then. And then, I almost missed this one. And this side has a styloid process called the ulnar styloid process, or you can call it even the medial styloid process if you want, or the radial styloid process, or lateral styloid process. And that's going to be, again, that sharp little tooth at the bottom of the bone, at the distal part of the bone. And just because these bones, again, they have an orientation to them, right? This bone you can see on thumb side, therefore this is our radius, and this is going to be our ulna in green. And so you can see on pinky side. And when we rotate our forearm, when we pronate our forearm, you can see that the bone still is going to be on thumb side. It's still on thumb side. That joint in between them, this connective tissue, this is made out of dense, regular connective tissue, made out of fibrocytes that produce their collagen fibers in a very wavy, parallel-like way. And so they keep bones together, and that's an example of a ligament. Remember that ligaments keep bone to bone attached. Tendons keep muscles to bones attached. And to that same effect, here you can see that this would still keep them together. Even as they rotate, they would still keep them bound in between each other. Next. This becomes the easiest part of the entire limb. If we start at the very top, you can see the radius first. Let's get organized. Radius, and then we can see our ulna, the head of ulna, and the ulnar styloid process, the radial styloid process. And then you're going to have all these little bones that make up your palmar region. On the exam, we are not going to take one of these out and say, what is this? We would not do that to you and just throw it on the table. You would see it all together as a hand, so all your boxes should have a hand model just like this. And it's really easy to learn. Well, after you've learned it once. So for this bone, I like to start more from the distal side. from the fingertips. It's actually a little bit easier to start from the fingertips. When you look at this portion, you already know what it's called because it's just the phalanges. All the first three, 1, 2, 3, are phalanges. Phalanges, 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 phalanges. And they're simply named after terms that you already know. Distal is going to be the furthest one. Proximal is going to be the closest one to the shoulder, to the trunk of the body. And then the one in between is simply called the middle. And this word phalanges is plural. Plural. And this word is phalanx, which is singular. Singular. Phalanx. And it has an X attached to it. Phalanx. And so if you're referring to just this bone, you would say distal phalanx. That would be the right way to say it. This one you would say middle phalanx, and this one you would say proximal phalanx. Proximal phalanx. That's the appropriate way to use it. But altogether, all three, the phalanges. Phalanges. Ask away.
So for the test, you would want us to put proximal phalanx?
Yes. Yes, I would love it if you wrote distal phalanx if it's pointing to just this bone. That would be the perfect answer. And so, only thing to add, and what concerns me always, is this part of the thumb. The thumb follows its own rules. You'll notice that it's a lot the shortest finger you have, and it's missing a phalanx. So it actually only has a distal phalanx and a proximal one. It does not have a middle one. So the thumb does not have no middle phalanx. No middle phalanx. All right, and to finish up, we have two more little segments. This entire range that follow the phalanges is going to be called the metacarpals. Like metacarpal was the wrist, remember that was the wrist, and so metacarpal. And so here you can see this bone. It's our first bone. The thumb represents digit number 1, always. Digit number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And this one's referred to as metacarpal 1. This one's referred to as metacarpal 2, metacarpal 3, metacarpal 4, metacarpal 5. If you're not familiar with your Roman numerals, this V represents a 5. And when you put this in front of a 5, it actually means 4. And that's it for the metacarpals. Now these bones, you're going to need probably an acronym for this, and it goes in this order that you see these numbers. You have scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, pisiform, and then you have to go back to number 5 here. It goes 1, 2, 3, 4, and like a typewriter, all the way to this side, okay? It doesn't go like this. Don't think about it like this. Think about it like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, back to the beginning here. 5, 6, 7, 8. And this number 5 is going to be trapezium, number 6, trapezoid, number 7, capitate, and number 8, hamate. And so use this acronym that goes, put this down. Oops. Sexual lovers try positions that they can't handle. There we go. And use the first letter to help you with the order of the words, although that could be a little confusing because there's a few of them with the word T, starting with T. And so be careful with that. That's going to be the hardest part about all of this, is not the order, but remembering which is the T's here, because trapezium, trapezoid sound so close together, and then you got triquetrum to kind of confuse you a little bit more. And so those become the tougher ones to learn. And so to apply this acronym, you want to make sure that you can actually count them down. Like as you count the bones, you use the acronym. Sexual lovers try positions that they can't handle. You want to go in that order. Be careful, because sometimes you be inclined to do this and you'll completely ruin the order of that acronym and it won't work. You have to typewriter it and then come back this way. And so, where to start? Find your thumb. That's going to be my best advice for all of you. I use it still to this day, is that I look for the thumb, and then I know that the second bone, or when I go down, I'm going to skip this bone, and I found my first bone, because it's going to be attached to the radius, And so this segment here is going to be your scaphoid. So again, the rule is find your thumb, see the first one, skip it, and then you found the first bone to sort of begin your thinking process. It's going to be the best way to identify these bones. Try to use this. I still use it to this day, and it helps me just find the bones pretty fast. Yes?
Can I share, like, that's something that I use that helps me memorize?
Yes, go ahead.